Okay, Melissa, so you have done a couple classes where you're trying to kind of open up the kids' heads and try to figure out what they already are coming to class with regard to understanding force and motion. And so you've done an activity with the bricks, dragging them across carpet and other materials. And then you did a really cool thing with the rollerbladers in the hallway. So can you tell me what kind of sense you have of what kids already know, like some partial understandings?
So right away, something that I noticed is that kids seem to have some pretty good understandings of force, but they tend to speak about it in terms of like muscles, which I think might actually be a good way of imagining, that before we have spring scales or some way of really measuring the force, that they're sort of making a qualitative judgment about, like, it takes me more muscles to do this.
I heard that
so
too,
they're referring to force in the sense of like muscles, or I expected them to talk about like pulling harder, that, but I hadn't really thought of it in terms of like more muscles. So I thought that was kind of a good, it's a sort of cartoony maybe way of imagining force, but it's not a bad way of starting out. So I was glad to hear them thinking about quantities of force that way. And then I also heard a few groups with the carpet, and then it came up again with the rollerbladers. Instead of thinking of the word friction, there was a group of girls that kept talking about tension, like the tension between the brick and the carpet. And so I didn't replace the word with friction yet. I'm just
You're waiting
I just like
for that.
I just use their word of tension, but I can tell that the concept is there, that they have this idea of, and a lot of kids also represented like a grabbing between the carpet and the block. Some kids even paid attention to how one side of the block was more splintery than the other side, and so they talked about the splintery side grabbing more. And
They had some theories about like the microstructure of both the brick and the carpet.
Which, that was what I was pushing them to talk about. That's the model I was trying to get them to represent, so it doesn't surprise me that they got there, but they do have, it's not going to take too much to like leverage that this grabbing into a more standard way of talking about friction. And same thing with the girls that are using the word tension. Like, it's not going to be too hard to move that language into being friction. It's the same concept. So I think that they're getting it. And then the other really fruitful thing that I heard, like sort of raw idea, was one young man, Jael, started labeling the skaters as having two different kinds of feet. That one was a gliding foot and one was a pushing foot.
I remember hearing him talk about that.
And that, not only was that, interesting for Jael to think with, but all the kids from that section picked up that language too.
Right.
And they started referring to the feet as the gliding foot and the pushing foot. And that was really important because I heard them, like, that made them so that they could parse the movement into two different kinds of movement, that the gliding foot has one kind of motion that happens as a result of the pushing foot.
I think I heard that someone commented that to get the rollerbladers started, they had to make a little T with their back foot.
Right.
And then a few minutes later, I heard somebody else at the other end of the hallway talk about to
Stopping.
stop. You have to do the same thing.
Yeah.
So did you see some like partial ideas about force being exhibited and how they talked about that?
Right. Yeah. But they didn't necessarily use the word force. They used the word pushing foot.
Right.
You know, or the dragging foot. And so it was that they were tuning in to that the feet have different jobs, sort of in the act of rollerblading.
Yeah. So the rollerblader is not just a person anymore. The rollerblader is almost starting to get looked at as a system.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And then the idea of the gliding foot, I think that'll be really important down the road for thinking about inertia. And I like that I'm keeping it on sort of real world motion, because they're also starting to think about the complicated system of that there's always friction. Even though right now they're thinking of it as like dragging, you know, but it's nice that they aren't. Had I just started with the textbook, I think they might have gotten into these ideas of too much of like a frictionless system, because that's the way that sometimes physics ideas are presented as these abstractions where you're immediately asked to remove a force from the system, but nothing really moves that way. So I'm glad I'm keeping it on real world kind of movement.
Yeah, so you
that's
often
complicated
textbooks,
right away.
yeah, they'll just pull it away from everyday experiences kids have and ask them to just, it's a hard idea already to understand systems of forces, but then to force the kids to imagine this in a world that they are not familiar with is extra difficult.
Yeah, and so I've been asking a lot of questions about like, well, what if it was on ice, to try to move them to the reasoning where they take away the friction I mean, you can't take away the friction entirely, but to move them to an idea of like, what if we really significantly reduce the friction? And the group of girls especially got really stuck about the idea of a rollerblader trying to move on an icy surface. They couldn't reason with that, but the boys, Jael's team that had talked about the pushing foot and the gliding foot, they immediately were reasoning with that the pushing foot wouldn't work anymore if there was nothing to push against. So they immediately saw that the T starting and stopping maneuver wouldn't be very helpful on an icy surface where there wasn't any, or where there was so little friction.
So with that stopping and starting, eventually maybe Jael could, at the end of this unit, might be asked about the equal and opposite reactions and how it might apply to that stopping and starting that he was talking about with a skater.
Right. But I'm hoping that with a little bit more help, the group of girls that question kept stumping them, I would hope a few weeks from now that they won't be stumped by the icy scenario. That right now they're being stumped by the icy scenario because it might be that's the same group of girls that's using the tension idea, but maybe the tension idea isn't quite enough information. Like maybe they need to learn more standard ideas about friction to be able to reason through an icy scenario. That right now they get stuck on that scenario.
So you've already kind of guessed what my next question is going to be around language, and you've been talking about the language that they've used, like the language around tension and language around strength of pull, kind of anthropomorphizing the idea of force. And so you talked about that you were not going to try to bring in academic language at that point. So why did you not think, I'm going to talk about friction, I'm going to replace their language with the language of friction?
Well, I guess at this stage, it's more that I'm trying to get what their idea is on the table, and I don't care necessarily like if they're using standard ways of talking about the idea. So I was listening more for like, does anybody have any really sort of tangential ideas that I'm going to have to pay attention to? And I didn't hear too many like off-base ideas. Like these students seem to have made pretty good sense of forces in motion. They just don't have like physics ways of talking about them. So right now it was more like that I was listening to the idea of tension and trying to hear like, do they have some odd ideas about friction? But I don't think they do. I think they just have a different word for what they're saying. And so later on I will replace that word, but right now I don't need to replace the word because my objective was to hear what their idea was, like what was their model.
So you've again started to talk about my next question, which is good. You know what I'm going to ask here about alternative conceptions. And I think we're not talking about just kind of trivial kinds of not quite a full understanding that they have, but really consequential alternative conceptions that would really cause a hindrance to their thinking in a few days, did you see anything that caused you to say, I better address that?
So the thing that I did hear that I'm a little, not nervous, I kind of expected it, is an absence of an idea, that kids are paying attention to things like the weight, and they're paying attention to the grabbing or the dragging or the tension. They just aren't calling it friction.
With the bricks?
And with the skater, like they're paying attention to those ideas, but the things that they aren't paying attention to yet are, nobody is talking about normal force, but normal force doesn't exist as anything in their model.